So what's happening here? We're going to have a sort of conversation where I'm going to ask you some questions, and I've got a few that I've prepared, and we'll sort of see how we go. I've never done one of these before, so
I'm sure you've had a conversation.
I've had
before.
a conversation. I know. I suppose, yeah. I've never done it on a stage. Okay. So one of the things I was thinking about, is the narrative of Susie Orbach often starts with setting up the Women's Therapy Centre in London in 1976. So what I was quite interested to think about is, how did you get to that point? How did you get to psychotherapy, and how did you get to kind of wanting to do that, to set up that organisation?
Well, first of all, I couldn't have done it alone. I did it with my best friend, who continues to be my best friend. And I think that's worth knowing. Louise Eichenbaum, even though she lives in New York. And we had been in a women's studies program, the first one that existed as undergraduates in North America. And then we trained to be therapists. Why do we train to be therapists? This is really a fast history. We were very interested in the fact that it was the height of the second wave of feminism, and we didn't really understand why women from all different social classes and ethnic backgrounds, why, once we kind of knew that patriarchy structured us in certain kinds of ways, why we continued to participate in our own subordination or our own oppression. And we thought that none of the disciplines that we'd been studying, history, sociology, helped us understand what it means to be a human subject, and what it means to try to change, and how you do that. So that led us to psychology, psychoanalysis, a whole field of thinking about how people change. And out of that, I think it was a very privileged moment in feminism and in a young woman's life. We kind of scavenged whatever we wanted from conventional theories, particularly psychoanalytic and humanistic psychology, and we excavated them for what use they could give us. And we didn't feel at all bad about looking at the patriarchal bias, because that wasn't what we were interested in. We were interested in what use we could make together with this. And out of that, we thought, wait, we have new theory, we have new practice, we need a women's therapy centre. We knew that women were being, in those days, they went to mental hospitals if they expressed distress. There was no understanding of, there was the empty nest syndrome, all of which was true, but it was the way it was derogated. There was a lot of work. There was Braverman and Braverman's work showing that diagnoses of women, the ordinary activities men did was fine, that they were psychologically inadequate in women. We thought we need a space for women to come, to be listened to talk. That's why we created the Women's Therapy Centre. And at that time, we didn't have any funding. We just kind of went to funders with trying to figure out how to do things. And it was very successful for many years. It's not successful anymore, partly because feminism lost the day for quite a long time, and because once you get bigger, you then bureaucratize yourself and things like that, and leadership changed. And I was really interested. I too feel like I'm the great-great-grandmother of the Women's Therapy Centre, only it's got very diminished since then. It grew for a long time. But some of the ideas have penetrated into government documents, women in psychology, practice at Women's Aid, and practice in terms of how people are thinking about gender and almost anything that's kind of coming out today, whether it's Weinstein or whether it's Trump. I think there's a lot of critique that is founded on a much more, quite a profound analysis of how patriarchy gets inside of us. That was a very long answer, I'm sorry.
That's good, because I've only got about 3 questions. So the first people who came to the centre, can you tell us a little bit about the sorts of women who were making use of this as a service?
Well, it's probably hard for anybody who's under 45 here to know that when we set it up, therapy was like a no-go area. You just you didn't know how to even access therapy. And if you did, I mean, my parents were so outraged that I was a therapist that they called me a physiotherapist because it was too humiliating. And they didn't mind if they were changing class for me, if that, in those days. So who came? So we decided that we would let it be known through the local newspapers. We had local newspapers in that day and radio stations. And it was therapy for women and their families. And the people who originally came, there was, I suppose, 3 groups. Women who just heard something that we were talking about on the radio or in newspapers, thought, wait, that person seems to understand what I'm talking about. And there might be a woman who'd had a previous hospitalization or gone to her doctor and was on pills and didn't really feel understood. There might be women who didn't understand why they were in such difficulty emotionally. There were women who were in violent relationships but didn't have words for it. And then there was a group of women who were feminists who were looking for psychotherapy. They were the smallest group of the women. So they were cross-class, I would say. And it was in Islington, so it was kind of crossed. Not that it only responded to Islington, but it was cross-ethnicities and cross-ages. So I guess, and the most interesting thing I think about it, and I think if I'd just gone and worked in a clinic that wasn't like this, and for Louise too, is because we were starting with so many people at the same time, we noticed certain patterns. So we'd notice after about the first 6 sessions, people would say, well, thank you very much, thank you for helping me. And it was really interesting. They felt they had to, they couldn't continue with therapy because they had to look after us and our waiting list. And that was a real insight into the way in which women's caring and our own unentitlements meant that they were too busy taking care of us than daring to risk that they could have what they wanted. So that became a very important theoretical moment for us, which was to understand the complications of women's dependency needs not being met and women giving to everybody else. So there were those kinds of things that were very interesting, which seemed to go through whoever we were seeing, whether they were the academics who we were seeing, or they were women who were coming out of mental hospitals, or bins as they were then called.
So, I mean, you talk about the 6-week thing, which actually makes me think about CBT. And as I was just thinking about those different models, the different therapeutic models that are available to people. And I think that sometimes psychotherapy has a reputation for being quite elite. And, that it's expensive, that it's only available to certain types of people. And I think actually increasingly, because of the wider social context in which we're in and cuts that we're seeing through the NHS, that there are only certain types of interventions which are available to people generally and women in need. So I'm just wondering what your kind of reading of that current situation is about the kind of place of psychotherapy, I suppose, in potentially women's lives.
It's very weird, isn't it? Because on the one hand, it's ubiquitous. On the other hand, nobody can access it. And, we always have counselling teams. There is a disaster, there are counsellors on the team. People are laid off, but the actual experience of being able to access high-grade therapeutic services is really hard. Mm-hmm. And I think my side of the profession, as opposed to the psychologists, have been woefully inadequate at writing in the kind of language that NICE or the government can understand about our research results, right? We haven't tracked that. I mean, now the studies are all there, but they weren't, and therefore it was very easy. This is not really letting the civil servants off the hook, but it was very easy for the organizations that were producing access to the therapies to go for what looked like very fast cures, telephone therapy, CBT, etc. And all of these things have a place. In fact, there are so many people doing CBT who feel, oh God, I want to do something about meaning and depth. And there's no way to do psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic therapy without doing cognitive behavioral elements, because it's just not possible. So I wish we'd all get together and fight for really decent services, decent training, and easy access, which we really don't have. It's just impossible. And we didn't do it as an elite service at the time because first of all, we didn't charge unless people could afford to pay. Then people felt you have to pay, which I've never really believed in because I think you already pay. And now people do think of therapy as something that you pay for, which I think is, I think that's all to do with the neoliberal agenda, that you pay what you get. I think it's not something I support. I wish all the people that saw me didn't have to pay directly for treatment or for therapy.
It makes me think about there's something that's always fascinated me with the language, whether we're working in psychology or psychotherapy, about the people who access and what they're referred to. And it made me think when you talk about the neoliberal agenda, because I think in psychotherapy, people are referred to as patients, and sometimes they're referred to as a client, and sometimes they're referred to as a service user, and increasingly, actually, in some elements, we're talking about experts by experience. So there's a kind of that. I wonder what your kind of take is on that language.
I hate all of the nomenclature. I mean, I wish we had a word, and I use them interchangeably. And actually, I think we're all, in a way, we're all trying to reach and help the person and help ourselves while we're helping them. Let's not forget the other big secret about being a clinician is how fascinating and interesting it is for us and the kind of growth that we go through by being. But I don't like any of the words. I don't actually feel myself to be an interior decorator, which is why I don't think of them as clients. Although in one way, I am an interior reformulator, right? Patient gives dignity to some people and other people hate it. And Alison makes it sound ever so fancy. The people I work with, well, that's kind of what it is, but I don't have a word for it. I want to recommend something which is to do with a film about men. I don't know if all of you have seen The Works, but it's probably the most profound film I've seen about therapy ever. And it's a group of male prisoners at a high-security prison, Folsom Prison, in, I think it's California. And they've been in a therapy program. And these are guys you really would cross the street because you do not want to be anywhere near them. They are lifers and double lifers and triple lifers. And they've been in therapy. And ordinary punters come in for a 4-day workshop where these men are there. They choose 2 of these men, each of them, to be their buddies. And these men practice therapy on them. And it's absolutely life-changing. So it's the expert, I don't know what the phrase...
Expert by experience.
Expert by experience men, who are the most tough guys, going for the vulnerability of these ordinary men who've volunteered for this program. And they learn how... They learn and they deliver therapy, and it's just fantastic. And that has a root too in the beginnings of the Women's Therapy Centre, not because we did that, but because whatever was brought to us, we worked on ourselves. So whatever themes were coming up, we on our Wednesday meetings would always talk about as ourselves and our identification with the people we were seeing, not as they were different from us, but that we had similar struggles. Does that? I don't know why I went off on that tangent, but hey, what the hell?
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to ask you now. I'm going to go back to
Fifi.
Fifi. So, Fat is a Feminist Issue, first published 1978.
Yeah, it's horrific, isn't it? Really.
There was a second issue, 1982, which was more of a practical guide.
On and on. No, that's another book. That's Fifi 2.
Yeah. So in preparation for this conversation, I went to our library and I took out this edition, 1998.
Yeah.
And I'm going to read you something from the introduction.
Are you?
Yeah. Just very. This is how you began the new introduction for the 1998.
Gosh.
You said, "There's a part of me that wishes I wasn't writing this new introduction to Fifi, that the issues raised in the book about food, fat, thin, compulsive eating, bulimia, anorexia and body image were now neutral issues for women.
If only.
But how we eat, what we eat, how much we eat, even whether it's okay to eat, and the relentless struggle to get our bodies to be the way we want them to be are still major preoccupations for women of all ages today. Food and its place in women's lives continues to be painful and troublesome." So, this was 1998.
Don't.
20 years ago, commenting on something you'd written 20 years before that, 40 years. So, I'm just wondering where you think we are now.
You don't have to think very hard. We're in much more trouble. We are in so much more trouble. It is so normalized for people, not just girls and women, but boys and men, to be troubled about their bodies and their eating. And in fact, so troubled that they take for granted that they're going to be in trouble with this issue for the rest of their lives. They don't expect to be free of it. I mean, okay, they might surrender to the wellness agenda or this one or that one for a short, but they're kind of, that's the thing that's even more troubling. And the group I'm part of, called Endangered Bodies, which is an activist group, we've been running a campaign against Google and Apple and Amazon because they've been allowing their platforms to be used for cosmetic surgery apps for 6-year-olds, which is priming kids to think that their bodies are entirely contingent, that their bodies are something that they should be changing, they should be manufacturing. They're not like the dress-up things, you know, that I remember where it was full of play. These are quite deadly games, actually. And so you've got that at one end. You've got the teachers being preoccupied. You've got the parents being preoccupied. You've got mums wanting to get back into their, this is not to attack anybody, but wanting to get back into their pre-pregnancy genes as though pregnancy hasn't been the most profound thing in their lives, right? Up till that point. And you've got women in old age homes who've had anorexia for 50 years, you know, who are hunched over. I mean, it's just every part of women's experience. It has penetrated. There's so few women who aren't troubled. And I'm just furious about it, really, frankly, and dismayed and horrified. And one of the things that I think people don't realize is that the two richest people in Europe, one was Liliane Bettencourt, who died 3 or 4 weeks ago. She owns 30% of L'Oréal, so that's one of those industries. That's the style beauty industry. And the other one is the guy who owns Zara and all of those. And she was worth 39 billion, and he's worth 89 billion. Now, when you consider the tech industries, et cetera, it's pretty surprising that the fashion industry, which creates fast fashion, which makes people feel that we know does most terrible things in Bangladesh, not just in terms of the slavery of the workers, but in terms of what it does to what bleaching the cotton does to the water supply, the whole thing. I could, you know, there are two industries which have such an impact on girls and women, and increasingly boys, produce this incredible wealth. It's extracting something, and we're exporting it all over the world. So now, when I wrote Fifi, I think the difference is not only is it the penetration of ages and genders, if we're allowed to use that word anymore, but it's one of our greatest exports is body hatred. That is what we export around the world as an aspect of this is how you enter modernity. You get messed up about your body. You copy the westernized body. The clothes may be made in China or wherever, but you've got billboards of non-Chinese women showing the way that you're meant to have a body back to the Chinese people. Right? I'm just appalled. And forget the food industry, haven't even gone there. I mean,
I was about to say about the consumption in culture, the cultural, you know, that we watch food programs endlessly on TV. I mean, even walking here, I was quite, because I was thinking about what I might be asking you, and I went to university here at UCL, so I don't come through very often, but I got off at Warren Street and I walked down that road, and it was cafe after cafe, even, and one of them's called Eat. I did think about taking a photo and tweeting it to say I'm talking to Susie Orbach about this later. But this kind of idea, though, that we're, on the one hand, that we're in control of our bodies, and yet we're saturated by this notion of food. But, you know,
I also went to university here, and there was nowhere to eat. There was Cranks. That was about it in Soho. And I kind of knew that everybody there must have an eating problem, because why would they otherwise be eating or working there? And I'm very grateful that there's actually good fast food now. But that contrasts with the non-food foods that employ psychologists, let's not forget this, so they get the perfect bliss point, so the perfect relationship between fat, salt, and sugar, which on something that is purporting to be something in the range of a crisp or a something or a cheese, it might once have had. And so that, I mean, it is so terrible what the food industry does, because it isn't about the pleasure of food. It's about creating addictions. And of course, the diet industry is not a huge part, it's a significant part of the food industry. And the argument of Fifi, and the argument I will still make, is they make their money by having a 97% recidivism rate. Because if diets worked, you'd only have to do them once. So you've got a very nefarious industry at all ends. I could go on forever, but I know we've only got like a few minutes. We've probably run out of time already.
Okay, well, one of the things in your work, which I think has been particularly useful for many women and for men, is that actually often you write really accessible books which give people practical tips. So,
do I? Okay.
So you have your book on eating, and you know there's kind of advice there for people. But behind your work, there's always been, and you've talked about this already, is about that you're always putting it in that context about the issues around eating and issues around the body are a response from pressures from living in a sexist society. So, you know, the kind of feminist agenda behind that. And I think when I was thinking about what we've seen in recent days in relation to women's experiences of this sexist society, everyday sexism, but sexual assault behind a kind of the Me Too. I'm sure most people are aware of the Me Too hashtag and the number of women who are talking about that. So I was just kind of wondering what you think that psychotherapy and psychology has to offer to intervene in these, which are quite frankly damaging relations between men and women, beyond picking up the pieces in a therapy room.
Well, I think we learn something. So we learn about the costs of living in our society for girls and boys, women and men, and trans people. We learn about that. That is what we hear if we're clinicians, right? And I suppose, being a child of the 60s, I'm part of that group that thinks you have a social responsibility to make arguments about this. Not simply, it's not the patriarchy just hurts women. It really hurts men. It's not okay that little boys are being exposed to porn now and don't even understand it. It's not okay that girls think they have to have labiaplasty, because those things, we need to be speaking out about this. We need to be talking, so that's on one level about the costs of this. The other cost is, we know something about emotional literacy. We know the cost of not being able for boys to have feelings of vulnerability or complex. We know the cost of women looking after men the whole time emotionally and not looking after themselves, or of lining up with each other in misery stories rather in stories of much more complex. So I think we have huge responsibilities. Nobody hears what the clinicians hear, the actual devastation. And the fact that women go on. It's not that we're victims collapsed. I mean, I think that's part of a problem that people get wrong, is they think, right, you're victims. No, we're not. We are both victims and survivors, but let's put some real flesh on that. That says we become who we are, we apprehend who we are in the context in which we live. Our mothers have apprehended it, they've had assaults on them, They pass that on inadvertently. They prepare us inadvertently to enter into a world in which we try to make our way. And we need to talk about how serious that is and how wrongly we constitute society. Very hard thing to do. I mean, maybe there's a crack in the extreme neoliberal agenda at this point, maybe, but you know, it's not like I think we're all jumping up and thinking that there is, because we've got something so terrible across the ocean, the Atlantic, so awful. It is the most terrible assault on every possible value, you know, and it's so full of rage and racism. It is completely motivated by that. It isn't motivated, I don't think, by sexism. I think it is motivated by racism. And, you know, we've got a very big job to do. I don't know how I got onto that one, but okay.
Well, I like what you said about the hearing stories, because I think that is, you know, I think back to the point about the Me Too campaign, is that we've always had stories about sexual abuse and exploitation, and there are stories of racism, which, you know, that people might whisper to each other, or you might hear in the therapy room. But it's as if that we can only hear these stories in the public domain at certain points in time. We know that in relation to sexuality, for example, stories around sexuality and coming out stories, which now actually we don't need to hear so much, but there are kind of other ones which are coming to the forefront. So I think it's really important that the role that psychotherapists and psychologists could play. But we do also seem to, and maybe this isn't the psychotherapists, maybe this is the psychologists, as Jan talked about earlier, we have a kind of entrenched conservatism, you know, often within our discipline, and a kind of reluctance to intervene, actually, into that political arena.
Oh, well, I think psychotherapists probably intervene less. You know, I can count on my hand the ones of us who do. But we do have psychotherapists for social responsibility. We do have that, and there's Division 39 in America, which is very political. It's part of the American Psychological. It's the clinicians wing, but it's it's really good about doing that. And I think we have to be bolder. I don't know what we have to be so quiet about now. I mean, it's time to take up our space. You know, if you can be designing the pound note, we certainly can be making our arguments about what kind of shapes don't work in terms of what it does to pervert the experience, or not pervert, but to shape our experience of being human in ways that are so damaging.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to ask you one last question, which is, a lot of the time today we've been looking back at the place of women in psychology and history, the role that they've played in history. So I'm just wondering, I'm going to invite you to look forward about what do you think are the biggest challenges coming at us, and what sorts of actions that we might be able to play.
I think I need notice of that question. Because I think we've just said one of the challenges, which is to go from inside to outside. And I think to understand how precious human beings are, and how very, very early damage is created. And we need to talk about how to help new mums or new parents, how to think about what we know from attachment theory, what we know about the denial of emotional expression. I don't mean Oprah Winfrey breastfeeding, but the inability to manage complex emotions, to have them seen. We need to work on recognition, but you know, we also need to work on why we can't accept others, what this is in the human condition, others, whether they're designated as male, you know, Afro-Caribbean, doesn't really matter. That is one of our essential problems, that we go into fundamentalist modes of thought and feeling out of fear. So we really need to understand that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Please join me to thank Susie Orbach.